On January 13th, 1980, a 41-year-old National Park Service ranger named Paul Braxton Fugate left the visitor center at Chiricahua National Monument to check a nature trail and never returned. He was in uniform, he carried the tools of his trade, and he told colleagues he would be back. He did not come back. Investigators searched, the community searched. Nothing was ever found that explained why a trusted ranger simply vanished on a winter afternoon. To tell what happened to Paul Fugate, we have to start small, with the ordinary gestures of a man who knew these rocks and ravines like a second map. He'd worked for the Park Service. He knew which slope catches early sun, when the hidden hollows hold wind, and how the animals behave when a human is near. In a place like Chiricahua, the landscape is not neutral. Paul heard it. That's what makes his absence not just a missing person case, but a break in a conversation the park has been having for millennia. The last verified time anyone saw Paul was around 2 in the afternoon. He left the visitor center, reportedly told an aide he was going to do a trail, and asked that the staff close up if he wasn't back by 4:30. That was the plan. He stepped out in his green and gray uniform, the arrowhead patch on his sleeve and the gold ranger badge over his heart. People looked at him and watched him go the way any coworker watches a man head into the world that he owned. He did not return. When someone disappears in a national park, the first assumption is often that they were lost, injured, or caught by weather. Rangers are trained for that. They know search patterns and the slow logic of finding a broken boot print or a snagged sleeve. Here, though, the logic bent towards something else. Intensive searches were launched immediately. Helicopters, tracking dogs, volunteers from neighboring counties. The machinery of a mounted search began to hum. They combed the faraway ranch area and nearby trails, following every lead. They found no trace of Paul. No body, no gear, no sign. It was as though he'd stepped over the boundary of the park and into an absence. There are at least 2 ways to tell a disappearance: the official record and the rumor map. The official record is careful and legal, an arc of notes and checked boxes. The rumor map is less tidy. People remembered seeing a pickup truck. They remembered a figure slumped between 2 men. They remembered the visiting hours of hunters and the presence of people who moved through these hills in ways that were not always above board. Some reports tied the area to drug trafficking at the time. Others suggested he may have been taken by people who did not want witnesses. The rumor map gave the investigators places to look. The official record left them with questions. In the months and years after Paul disappeared, the case cooled only for it to flare. For decades, the searches produced nothing. Then, decades later, new information prompted the National Park Service and Cochise County to reopen inquiries, to offer renewed rewards, and to ask people who might know something, anything, to step forward. In 2018, the reward fund was raised, and the case was publicly re-urged. The point of increasing a reward is not just to buy information, it is to reawaken memory. People forget details until they are reminded. Sometimes a cash incentive brings a fractured memory to the surface. Sometimes it does not. But the reopening acknowledged what everyone, the family, the colleagues, already knew. This story was not finished. If you want to follow the thread, the timeline is compact and brutal. On a winter Sunday, he left the visitor center. By evening, he was overdue. By the next morning, a search was underway. Witnesses were interviewed, equipment and cars were checked. Investigators at the time suspected foul play, but they also acknowledged the possibility of an accident. The terrain is rugged. The climate in January can be sharp, and trails can mislead even experienced people. Yet the absence of any physical trace and the specific details that would later emerge made this case more than a simple missing person file in the county records. Let's slow the clock and look closely at the pieces that made investigators uneasy. First, when someone disappears into wilderness, there are usually small artifacts: a boot snagged on a bush, broken watch crystal, a torn sleeve. Here, crews found a tidy pack of possibilities and no debris. Second, a local acquaintance, a detail that appears in multiple retellings, claimed to have seen Fugate later that afternoon, slumped between two men in a pickup truck. That sighting was never conclusively verified, but it lingered in the rumor map because it suggested a route off park property rather than a trail mishap. Third, the park was, at the time, a landscape in motion, not just geologically, but socially. Hikers, hunters, and itinerant people moved through, and some of them were not on official maps, all of which made the investigators widen their search grid while also widening their hypotheses. Here's one detail you'll hear again and again. The Park Service record notes the uniform. Why does that matter? Because a man in uniform walking alone in his park is not unusual. But when a uniformed person disappears, it becomes a question of the park's integrity and its ability to watch its own rangers trust each other. They watch each other, and the disappearance of one of their own sent a particular alarm through United States Park Service channels. The investigative files make that friction visible. Colleagues who were professional and raw with worry, a family that pressed for answers, a chain of jurisdictional calls between county and federal agencies. Over time, multiple theories clustered. Some investigators and locals suspected robbery or an altercation that escalated. Others leaned toward foul play tied to outside elements moving through the area. A third narrative suggested that he might have chosen to disappear, start a new life, leave the burden of complicated home life behind. Though that theory never sat well with family, who argue it was not his nature, and for a small set of people, the eerie option remained, that some unknowable danger in the landscape took him. The job of a script like this isn't to pick a theory, it's to weigh them and to hold the ambiguity while we look for patterns. To make this real, to give texture to absence, we reconstruct the day as closely as the record allows. Picture the visitor center at Chiricahua on a clear January afternoon. The air is thin. The hoodoos and stone columns throw long shadows. Paul checked a trail, as he had done countless times, with a parka at hand and boots that had worn the same paths he expected, as rangers do, a predictable return. The last reliable image we have is of a man stepping into the world he knew. The next reliable thing is the absence his family felt when he failed to come home. From a narrative standpoint, that leap from ordinary to vanished is the cut that the story runs along. What happened in the immediate aftermath is a lesson in the limits of search and rescue. In rugged country, teams used dogs. They climbed slopes by hand. They checked every watercourse and cliff shelf where someone might be trapped. They sent patrols and canvassed vehicles. They interviewed locals. They looked into the possibility that someone had forced him into a vehicle and driven out. They checked hospitals, jails, and morgues. Nothing matched. In such cases, every non-match becomes its own clue. The lack of evidence forces the investigation to ask deeper, stranger questions. 38 years later, in 2018, the National Park Service announced new interest and a tripled reward. That move came after new information came to light that investigators decided was worth formally pursuing. Increasing the reward is a sign that an investigation is active again and that officials believe there are still people with information who have not come forward. It is also, practically, an attempt to crowdsource memory in a different era. The rise of social media, Digital archives and renewed local attention can produce leads that old notebooks did not. The NPR and NPS announcements framed it as a cold case being pushed back into the light. Now we come to the sticky edges, eyewitness accounts that conflict, a timeline that shifts, and the details that keep a case alive in rumor long after the evidence cools. One person reported seeing a man in a pickup truck that afternoon. Another swore a different route had been used. Some said they saw Paul slumped and alive. Others said the truck drove off with two men who looked like they belonged to a work crew. Inconsistencies like these are not evidence of a cover-up. They're evidence of human memory, a thing that can be wrong and still sincere. Graphs of those witness reports show overlapping possibilities, not a single path. What that does, though, is focus us. If there was a vehicle leaving the park that afternoon, where did it go, and who was in it? Consider the social geography of southeastern Arizona in 1980. This is border country, a place where routes cross and people move through on many scales. Seasonal workers, travelers, hunters, and sometimes contraband investigators were alive to that context. They asked whether the region's movement patterns could have intersected with Paul's path. They looked at records of traffic on back roads. They tried to see whether an outside party could have abducted him, and they considered the possibility of an accident that left no trace in the places they were looking. The point here is not to say one theory is right. It is to show that each plausible mechanism explains some facts and fails on others. One of the haunting things about Paul's disappearance is how ordinary all of his last reported behavior was. He was not out of uniform. He was not concealed. He did not leave a note. A man who knew the park and its edges left in the light of day and did not come home. That absence amplified the search effort because people could not accept that the park, the institution they trusted, could not account for one of its own. It became, for many, a question about the limits of institutional control in wild places. That thread, trust in institutions versus the openness of the wild, runs through the case like a hidden map. We have to be clear. There are no authoritative, fully accepted answers here. Plenty of theories have been floated, some plausible, some less so. The investigators at the time considered foul play. Local reporters wrote about possible sightings and about the town's unease. The family, understandably, held hope that Paul might yet be found alive or that an explanation would appear. Decades later, the case carries the weight of what murders and mysterious disappearances carry: anger, grief, and a hunger for closure. The NPS's revival of interest is a recognition of that unresolved human cost. If you look for patterns across other unsolved vanishings, you find two recurring motifs. First, the social element, the people who move through a landscape and how they interact. Second, the material silence, the absence of a body, a shoe, a torn sleeve. Both are present here. The rumor map suggests possible routes off the land. The absence suggests something deliberate, efficient, or extraordinarily unlucky. That double puzzle is what keeps investigators and curious observers returning to the files. You can imagine, as many have, a scenario where Paul was taken by people who intended to smuggle or intimidate, and another scenario where he walked into a gap in the world and never returned. Both explain parts, and neither explains all. A small but crucial element in the public conversation about this case is the family's voice. In local interviews and news pieces, Paul's wife described the ongoing pain and the decades spent demanding answers. Families of missing persons often carry the emotional labor of keeping a case alive, arranging meetings with investigators, pushing for reopened searches, keeping press interest alive. The revival of the reward in 2018 was, in part, a response to that pressure, both compassionate and pragmatic. It is the state and the family saying together, "We will keep looking." That insistence, more than any single theory, has sustained this case in public memory. From a narrative perspective, the hardest thing to hold is patience. The script to this point is a slow, relentless paring back of possibility, but we must also honor the investigative moves that produced real progress. In recent years, new records and re-examinations of the old files produced small leads that were enough to justify renewed attention. The point of returning to cold cases is not romantic, it is forensic. Advances in data search, the ability to cross-reference vehicle registrations, and the memory recall generated by an increased reward can, and sometimes do, change outcomes. We must keep faith with the work, even as we keep an eye on the heartbreak. There are also cultural reverberations worth noting. Chiricahua sits within a landscape rich with indigenous history and contested memory. For local people, the monument's stones carry stories older than the Park Service's tenure. The disappearance of a ranger, therefore, is not only a criminal or missing person story. It is an event that intersects with local histories, with local economies, and with the fragile infrastructures that maintain public lands. That context matters because it shapes the kinds of leads people will report and the kinds of records investigators can find. You cannot do justice to a place without listening to its many temporal scales. Let's return now to the clip we opened with, the found footage from a ranger locker. Imagine the footage as a small, grainy relic, a fixed camera frame that catches a shadow at the tree line, and a radio voice that replies in the wrong cadence. The power of found footage in cases like Paul's is that it makes absence into presence. It gives a surface where memory and physical evidence can meet. That particular clip, whether directly related to Paul's disappearance or not, functions as a kind of emblem for the case. Something recorded, something listened to, something that doesn't fit. It is the visual hook that keeps people watching, but the audio detail, the voice that is close but not right, is the thing that haunts the mind. How do investigators work such a file? They treat it like any other piece of evidence. Check metadata, verify provenance, match timing to logs, and test the voice against known call signs and frequencies. They ask whether the tape could have been planted, whether the radio reply came from inside or outside the park, whether the patch of ground in the frame is actually the area reported. With old footage, degradation and missing context can make answers vanish. That is why modern cold case work often starts with a simple question: who exactly had the tape, and when did they get it? The chain of custody can be more illuminating than the footage itself. At heart, the Fugate case is about the limits of seeing. In a park built of columns and caves, sight is always filtered by shadow. People miss things. Dogs can miss scent. Cameras can be pointed elsewhere. Even meticulous investigators run against the fact that wilderness is designed to swallow the trace of transient bodies. The course of this story, the factual skeleton of leaving and never returning, resists tidy answers because the world itself conspires to conceal. That is the melancholy lesson. Yet there are small, stubborn facts that keep the file alive. We know who he was, what he wore, and roughly when he left. We know the search's scale and the sparse public leads that emerged later. We know officials raised the reward decades later and publicly invited new tips. We know the family's pain and their demand for answers. Those are the coordinates we use to move forward. They do not tell us what happened, but they show where to look and whom to ask. So what next? For investigators, the next steps are painstaking. Re-interview witnesses who may recall a small, overlooked detail. Re-examine vehicle records and property transfers in the weeks after the disappearance. Cross-reference local industry records and call logs. Encourage anyone with memory of the day to step forward. For a filmmaker or storyteller, the next step is also moral: to treat the family's pain with respect, to avoid ghoulish speculation, and to present the facts in a way that invites help rather than voyeurism. For you, the viewer, the next step might be to look at the dates and places and ask whether someone in your networks recalls something new. Information ages. Memory does not always. We close where we began, with an 8-second clip and a question that refuses to shrink. Paul left to check a trail and did not come back. The Park Service keeps a ledger of the missing and the solved. His name remains in the ledger of the unsolved. That is a hollow, not just in paperwork, but in people's lives. The reward is more than money. It is a request that this nation's attention be directed back at a small patch of rock where a man's footsteps ended. If you have any information, the hotlines and the public appeals are real and live. The hope is that someone will remember a vehicle, a face, or a turn on a dusty road that, decades ago, might have meant everything. We will follow up on this case in a second episode where we will dig into the new leads investigators say they are examining, and we will look at the archival material that suggests specific routes. If you want the records we used in this episode, check the description. We'll link the National Park Service release, the long-form reporting that reopened attention, and local news pieces that kept the family's voice in public view. For now, ask yourself, when someone disappears into a landscape that has watched people move for centuries, what does it mean to look back? What does it mean to keep looking until the light returns to a small, cold place? But before anyone could follow that trail, something else surfaced. A detail buried in an old seasonal logbook. A note scribbled by a volunteer who worked the same week Paul vanished. One line. Almost nothing, but enough to reopen the timeline, enough to complicate it beyond repair. He wrote that on the morning Paul disappeared, he heard 2 voices in the visitor center before opening hours. One was Paul, the other he didn't recognize. Low, calm, as if reading from something. When investigators asked him later what the second voice said, he answered with the same phrase every time. I can't place the accent. Not foreign, not familiar, just wrong somehow. Like someone trying to copy a tone they'd never actually used before. That note wasn't included in the public summary. It sat in a cardboard box for years, unmentioned, untouched, but it becomes important when you compare it with what came next. Because within minutes of those voices, Paul left the building without signing out, something he never forgot to do. Not once. He walked toward the trailhead. No pack, no radio, nothing someone planning a field inspection would carry. And the most unusual detail? He didn't lock the door behind him. Rangers were strict about that. Especially Paul. It bothered his colleagues so much that 2 of them went looking for him just an hour later, and even they couldn't agree on what they saw. One said Paul was walking normally, almost relaxed, as if following someone he trusted. The other said he saw no one, just a shape moving between junipers, too far to identify but close enough to imply he wasn't alone. It shouldn't be possible for both accounts to exist, yet they do, and both are still in the case file. By the time the first search began, the desert light was dropping. A thin copper glow stretched across the rocks. Tracks were found, just a few, but they didn't behave like normal tracks. The stride length changed abruptly, something seasoned trackers described as unnatural, not panicked, not hurried, just inconsistent, like someone adjusting to terrain they weren't familiar with. or someone trying to mimic footsteps instead of making their own. One print in particular stood out, a partial heel impression that was deeper than the others. Too deep for a man Paul's size, unless he suddenly put his full weight onto one leg. Searchers marked it, photographed it, then circled outward. They expected a continuation. Instead, the trail simply dissolved 5 meters later. Not faded, not lost, gone. The desert doesn't erase signs like that in minutes. Later, one ranger admitted quietly that he'd felt watched during that first sweep. He didn't include it in his report because it sounded irrational. But several years later, when he was interviewed again, he finally described it. The sense of someone standing just behind his peripheral vision. Not close, not threatening, but fixed on him in a way that made the hairs on his arms lift. He said the air felt charged, like static before lightning, the same sensation people describe before seeing a mirage, except nothing followed it. No shapes, no movement, no light, just that feeling. Then came the radio calls, the ones they still can't explain. At 4:12 p.m., dispatch logged a transmission from Paul's channel, a brief click, a faint exhale, and what sounded like a single syllable, not a word, just the start of one. Like someone testing the mic. The cadence didn't match Paul. It was slower, throatier, and when they triangulated the source, they found nothing at the coordinates. Just a patch of stone slope where no footprints existed. A second transmission came 20 minutes later. Same channel, same odd breathing. But this time, a ranger swore he heard a whisper beneath it, a phrase he couldn't decode. Something low and deliberate, as if spoken too close to the mic. When audio specialists examined the tape, they found no evidence of editing or interference, but they did confirm one detail. The voice didn't match Paul at all. And more strangely, it didn't match anyone else in the department. They checked every ranger on duty, every volunteer, every known visitor. No match. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the timeline became. Witnesses contradicted each other in small, subtle ways. A couple driving through the monument claimed they saw a man in uniform standing by the road, staring at the ground as if searching for something he'd dropped. They mentioned the uniform had a darker badge shape than usual. They didn't think anything of it until they heard about the disappearance days later. Another hiker insisted he heard someone calling a name, Paul's name, but the tone wasn't urgent, not distressed. More like someone running a test, letting the name roll off their tongue. When asked why he didn't investigate, he answered simply, "It sounded like someone practicing how to say it." The most unsettling detail came from a fire crew member who admitted he saw a figure on an outcrop at dusk, a silhouette, perfectly still, not looking toward the searchers, not signaling, just standing there, angled slightly as if its attention was fixed on something in the ravine below. When he radioed to confirm the sighting, 2 searchers turned to look. They didn't see the silhouette, but they both reported hearing rocks shift on the slope moments later, as if something had moved without sound, except for the stone under its feet. By that point, the case had already fractured into theories: foul play, voluntary disappearance, heat stroke-induced wandering, but none of those explained the radio transmissions. None explained the mismatched witness accounts, and none explained why Paul left behind everything essential to survival. The official search lasted 8 days. Unofficially, rangers kept combing the area for weeks. Some returned after hours. Some searched on their days off. One ranger said he started waking up at night, convinced he heard someone walking past his bunkhouse window. Slow steps, pausing occasionally, as if listening for movement inside. He never saw anyone. But after the 3rd night, he moved rooms. By the time winter rolled in, The desert swallowed the last of the physical evidence. Grass stiffened. Dust settled. The prints vanished. Only the witness contradictions remained, and the audio tapes that grew stranger every time specialists revisited them. Because years later, when technology improved, analysts isolated a background tone in the second transmission, a faint hum, rhythmic, almost patterned, not mechanical, not natural, more like breath layered on breath, and behind it, barely perceptible, the tail end of a second syllable, as if the unfinished word from the earlier tape had been attempted again, longer this time, more confident, but still not recognizably human. And maybe that's why Paul's case still lingers in the minds of the people who worked there. Not because of the theories, not because of the paperwork, but because every person who searched for him walked away with the same quiet thought they never wrote down, that whatever happened to him didn't finish happening on the day he vanished. That something out there waited, watched, listened, and learned just enough to step forward when no one was looking. Some say the desert keeps its secrets because no one ever digs in the right place. Others say the secrets aren't buried at all. They're still moving, still shifting between the rocks, still repeating the things they hear, trying to get closer, one syllable at a time. If you've ever been to Chiricahua, you know the sound the wind makes when it cuts through the spires at night. A long, low breath, almost like someone testing a voice. And if you ever hear your name carried inside it, you'll understand why the case has never settled. Tell me what you think happened out there and which part of this story stayed with you the longest.